Hello, today we will be reading Scene 4 of Act 2 of William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. In our last lesson, we read Act 3, and just as a reminder, in Act 3, Romeo had gone to the friar to ask him to marry Romeo and Juliet that day. The friar consented, he agreed, and he said, "The reason that I agree to marry you is hopefully your coming together, your marriage, will end the fighting of your two households once and for all." Now in scene 4, we are just on a street and we're going to see Benvolio and Mercutio. Now this is the next day, okay, or the same day rather as scene 3, but it's like an hour later or so. So Romeo is going to be returning home from visiting the friar, and you're going to see in the conversation between Mercutio and Benvolio that Romeo never came home the night before, and they're talking about the reasons why they think that this is. So they're going to be talking about the reasons Romeo didn't come home, and then they're going to give us a hint as to something else that happened early that morning, so pay attention to what that is. And we are only going to read the first little bit, and then I'm going to have us pause, and we're going to skip some of this scene because it's rather lengthy and unnecessary. So if you would, please read scene 4 to line 27. Go ahead and pause me now. So at the start of the scene, we see Mercutio and Benvolio kind of guessing where Romeo spent the night last night, and they think that he spent it with Rosaline. On line 3, Benvolio responds to Mercutio's question, "Where was Romeo? Did he come home tonight?" Benvolio says, "Not to his father's, I spoke with his man." And Mercutio says, "Why, that same pale, hard-hearted wench, that Rosaline torments him so that he will sure run mad." So they think that Rosaline is the reason that Romeo didn't come home, whether that means that Romeo spent the night with her or Romeo was just so distraught over her that he didn't return. Then Benvolio, on line 6, tells us something interesting that has happened. He says, "Tybalt, the kinsman to old Capulet, has sent a letter to his father's house." And Mercutio says, "A challenge on my life." So what they're saying here, Benvolio says, Tybalt sent a letter, and the letter was for Romeo. And remember, Tybalt is Juliet's cousin, and Tybalt saw Romeo at the Capulet party, and remember, Tybalt got really angry when he saw Romeo there, and he wanted to kill him on the spot, but his uncle stopped him, thankfully. And when Tybalt left the party, he said, "I will get revenge on that Romeo." So here Tybalt sends a challenge, a duel challenge, right? He's sending Romeo like a fight. He's like, "I want to fight you." And Mercutio says, "I bet that's what it is. I bet he's challenging him to a duel. And Benvolio says Romeo will answer it, right? Benvolio thinks that Romeo is for sure going to answer the challenge, and there's going to be a massive fight. And then Mercutio starts talking about the Prince of Cats, right? He starts talking about Tybalt and all of his fighting skills. Now, of course, remember, Mercutio is a very dramatic character. He's a dreamer. He likes to really get into the stories that he's telling. So he's talking about Tybalt and how he's skilled at fencing. And as he's talking about how Tybalt is skilled at fencing, he himself is prancing around the stage, pretending to do all of these fancy fencing moves. So you have to just imagine that he's going quite wild at this portion. And then we're going to see Romeo enter, and Mercutio is just in such a state, prancing all around, waving his sword around like he's pretending to fight somebody, being ridiculous. He sweeps Romeo right into the ridiculousness, and Romeo plays along, right? This is if you were to walk in on your friends joking and they just sweep you right into the joke, and before long you are all laughing and joking along together. That's exactly what Mercutio does. So Mercutio and Benvolio see that Romeo is in much higher spirits because he's starting to joke around, and they get very excited about this. Now we are actually going to skip quite a few of the next lines. So we are going to skip all the way to line 81, okay? Because I just told you what happens in that section. They're just joking with one another. Mercutio and Romeo and Benvolio are joking around, having a good time. There's a couple of double entendres that happen there, a couple little dirty jokes. So we're not going to talk about those. So we're going to skip to line 81, and I would like you to just read a few lines. If you would, pause me and read lines 81 to 92. So in these lines, they're kind of finishing up the joking, and Mercutio says on line 81, "Why, is not this better now than groaning for love? Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo." He's like, oh, this is so much better than you being sad about Rosaline. Now you're back to your old self, right? So he's very excited. And Romeo on the last line, line 92, said, "Here's goodly gear," right? What they see is the nurse and her man Peter entering the stage. Now, a little bit of a word on what is going to happen here. We already talked about the nurse in Act 1 when we saw her getting Juliet ready for the Capulet party. So remember, the nurse is quite the character, right? Just to give you an idea of what she looks like, she's rather large, she's missing a lot of teeth, and she's not a very attractive woman. So the nurse is going to make what are called malapropisms. And a malapropism is when a word is used incorrectly. Okay, so she thinks it's the right word, but it's actually not the word that she meant to say. She's using it incorrectly. And Mercutio is going to make fun of her using double entendres. And double entendres are a pun that usually is sexual in nature. So he's kind of a dirty jokester, if you will. So you're going to see them making fun of her malapropisms and the way that she looks. So just try to pay attention to kind of those mishaps, those slip-ups that the nurse says, and how they kind of come back and joke with her. Now, of course, the nurse is being sent from Juliet, because remember, the night before, Juliet said that she was going to find a servant or something to come to Romeo to find out where and when they're going to get married, or if they even are going to get married. So she has sent the nurse, and the nurse has brought her servant Peter along with her. So what I would like you to do is go ahead and pause me now and read to line 133. Okay, so when the nurse first enters the scene, Mercutio right off the bat starts making fun of her by saying, "A sail, a sail." So he's saying, here comes a ship, right? And a ship is rather large. So here he is saying, here comes a giant lady, which is not very nice of him, but rather funny. And Mercutio on line 98 also says, "Good Peter." When the nurse asks for her fan, she says, "My fan, Peter." And Mercutio goes, "Good Peter, to hide her face, for her fan's the fairer face of the two." So again here, he's calling her ugly by saying, yes, give her a fan so that she can hide her face with it, because her fan is prettier to look at than her face is. So he's not being very nice to the poor nurse, but Romeo is being quite nice. But the nurse starts to get very upset with Mercutio. And the nurse says on line 117, this is her first malapropism. She says, "If you be he, sir," so if you be Romeo, "I desire some confidence with you." And by confidence, okay, she's messing up the word for conference, because a conference is like a meeting, and confidence, you know, is like feeling really good of yourself. So she meant to say conference, but she said confidence instead. Benvolio picks up on this malapropism, and he intentionally does a malapropism making fun of her. He says on line 118, "She will indict him to some supper." And of course he said indict when he meant invite, okay, because he's poking fun at her malapropism that she made in the previous line. So poor nurse Benvolio and Mercutio are not being very kind to her. And Mercutio on line 121 actually calls her a hare, which is a prostitute. Okay, so then he sings this song all about a hare, and he's saying basically she's not a prostitute unless she's using her ugliness to hide her promiscuity. So again, he calls her ugly and he calls her a prostitute, so he's not being very nice. And as he leaves, he asks on line 129, "Romeo, will you come to your father's? We'll to dinner thither." Romeo says, "I will follow you." And then Mercutio and Benvolio leave so that Romeo and the nurse may talk by themselves. Now, of course, if you were getting made fun of the way that the nurse had just been made fun of, you would be rather upset. So the nurse in these next few lines is going to be so upset that she can't even get her words out. She's very, very flustered. So I want you to go ahead and pause me now and read to line 172. So in these lines, of course, the nurse is very upset about what Mercutio has said. Mercutio really riled the nurse up, right? On line 138, she says, "And does speak anything against me, I'll take him down, and I'll woo lustier than he is, and 20 such jacks." So she's just like rambling, like, "Oh, I'll take him down. Oh, he got me all filed up." And then she reprimands Peter for not having her back. On line 141, she says, "And thou may stand by too and suffer every knave to use me at his pleasure. You just stood there and didn't say anything, didn't back me up." And Peter says, "I saw no man use you at his pleasure." He's like, "I didn't see anything wrong with it." So then the nurse gets quite upset at Peter as well. So there's this back and forth between Peter and the nurse. And the nurse threatens Peter if ye should, she threatens Romeo, right? Because she's already so worked up. So she uses that momentum to kind of threaten Romeo about Juliet. On line 150, the nurse says, "My young lady bid me inquire you out." So my young lady, Juliet, sent me to you. And a couple lines down on line 153, she says, "If ye should lead her into a fool's paradise, as they say, it were a very gross kind of behavior, as they say." So she's like, you better not be leading her astray, otherwise that is very rude behavior on your part. So she is kind of reprimanding him there. And then we have more malapropisms from the nurse. She is misunderstanding what Romeo is saying. And remember, the nurse is not an educated woman, so she doesn't understand a lot of the words that are being used. So Romeo says on line 159, "Nurse, commend me to thy lady and mistress, I protest unto thee." Now, the word protest just means like I say unto you. But the nurse misinterprets protest as propose, right? So she is misinterpreting it, and she gets all excited. She's like, "Oh, Juliet's going to be so excited that you're getting married." And on line 164, the nurse says, "I will tell her so that you do protest," and she means propose, which, as I take it, is a gentleman's offer. And Romeo's like, "Okay, this is not worth fighting with this lady to try to get her to understand, and I plan to marry Juliet anyway, so I will just tell her the plan and get rid of this nonsense." So then Romeo just tells her the plan on line 166. "Bid her devise some means to come to shrift, and shrift is confession. Come to shrift this afternoon, and there she shall at Friar Lawrence's cell be shrived and married." So he's saying, have her come this afternoon to Friar Lawrence's, where she will receive confession and she will get married to me. So that's the plan that Romeo gives to the nurse to relay to Juliet, and the nurse is quite excited about this. So in this next part, we are going to have another piece of the plan that is revealed, and then there's going to be another instance of foreshadowing. So I want you to see if you can figure out what the next part of the plan is, and then what the foreshadowing is as well. Go ahead and pause me now and read to the end of scene 4. So Romeo reveals another part of the plan on line 174. He says, "Within this hour my man shall be with thee, and bring thee cords to make a tackled stair, which to the high topgallant of my joy must be my convoy in the secret night." So what he's saying to the nurse here is, in a few hours, one of my servants is going to bring you a rope, which you will make into a ladder so that I can climb up to Juliet's balcony tonight. And that's so that they can be together tonight as man and wife. So that's the other part of a plan. And the nurse asks, "Can you trust your man? Is your man secret?" on line 182. And Romeo says, yes, he is. Now on line 186, the nurse reveals that there is another man in town, remember Paris, that wants to marry Juliet. The nurse says to Romeo, on line 186, "Oh, there is a nobleman in town, one Paris, that would fain lay knife abroad, but she, good soul, has a leave see toad, and very toad as see him." So she's saying Paris does want to marry Juliet, but she does not want to marry him. She thinks that he is a toad, right? Ugly and not worth her time. And then she continues to kind of ramble, but she says this thing about rosemary. On line 192, doth not Rosemary and Romeo begin with a letter? So she's asking, do Rosemary and Romeo begin with the same letter? Now, a word about rosemary. So back in this time period, rosemary, besides being an herb, was also used as a token of remembrance between lovers and a token of remembrance for the dead. So it was used both ways, as a token between lovers and a token for the dead. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing, because the nurse says that Juliet, on line 196, she hath the prettiest sententious of it of you and Rosemary. So she's saying that Juliet has a saying about Romeo and Rosemary that is very lovely, but the fact that Romeo is used for lovers and for death is where we get the foreshadowing in this scene. And then once that is all said, everybody leaves and is all excited about the moments that are to come. So we are going to end our lesson there for today. We will pick up next time with scenes 5 and 6 of Romeo and Juliet. If you're enjoying this guided study, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, The Bear Bodkin Bard, so that you can be updated on all future posts of all Shakespeare's greatest works. And if you would like the next video, the link is in the description below. I bid you a good day.